would you do if your neighbors turned on you overnight? If armed men stormed your home, herded you at gunpoint onto a train, and abandoned you in the desert? This isn't a dystopian fiction. This is America. Roughly 100 years ago, over 1,200 miners were exiled from a remote Arizona town for daring to demand fair treatment. The echoes of that day still murmur through these hills, through these mines, and through us. June 1917. Thousands of miners began to put down their tools and walk out of the mines. The corporation they worked for had exhausted their patience. It was Phelps Dodge who operated the Copper Queen mine here in Bisbee, a town nestled into the Mule Mountains of Arizona. The executives who oversaw this mine subjected workers to dangerous conditions daily, actively blasting rock around them as they worked with little protection. Accidents were frequent, and at times unpaid labor was demanded from the miners. In exchange for their time, Phelps Dodge paid its workers a small fraction of what the copper at the time was truly worth. And it paid its quote-unquote non-American workers even less. Race potentially played a big part of your life as a miner here in Bisbee in the 1910s. If you managed to get a job here as a non-white person, you were paid less than everybody else. In fact, if you were Mexican, there was even a time here when you would have been forbidden from working underground at all. The general manager of this mine, William H. Brophy, made it clear to the miners early on that there would be no compromises made. The copper, gold, and silver embedded in these mountains mattered far more to the business than the people employed to retrieve it. So the tired miners had no choice but to take action. Many of them sought support from the International Workers of the World, an influential union known for organizing across industries. They fought for fair pay and worker safety, and embraced workers of all races and all nationalities. The IWW was founded in Chicago in 1905 and reached their peak membership the summer of 1917. But on the eve of the First World War, they were labeled a subversive, fringe, and potentially anarchist organization by those at the top. They've always been able to slap the word socialism on a just cause and then watch everybody turn on it. Like when they lynched IWW leader Frank Little that same summer. Phelps Dodge is furious. This wasn't Russia. This was the Wild West, the American frontier. Copper prices were booming, yet the beloved Copper Queen mine was at risk. That's when Walter Douglas, company president, decided that there would be no radical labor politics here. To protect this slice of earth that they had claimed as theirs, the corporation that owned Bisbee turned its weapons on the men it had entrusted to work its mines. July 12, 1917. Imagine seeing 2,000 armed men pour down into this town. A swarm of brand new sheriff's deputies and hired guns would have descended from the hills as the sun kissed these hilltops. They chose to meet the striking miners in equal numbers that morning. Many of these men were locals, longtime neighbors, and even friends of the miners' families. In response to the strike, the Citizens Protective League was formed, claiming that there was a threat to peace and production. This was a posse of self-declared real Americans. At the center of this all was the Cochise County Sheriff, Harry C. Wheeler. That morning, he published an article in the town paper ordering all women and children to stay inside while he oversaw one of the largest kidnappings in American history. Somehow, this sheriff had pulled off reaching out to and deputizing over 2,000 men under the cover of darkness. All of this to confront the strikers on this summer morning. Harry C. Wheeler is remembered as one of the last great lawmen of the Old West. Hollywood once made movies about men like him, but Wheeler was actually born in Florida. At the age of 22, he signed up for the Spanish-American War, where he served in the 1st Cavalry until 1902. He then found his way west and became an Arizona Ranger. I imagine he would have loved patrolling the American frontier and going after bandidos until his career was cut short when the agency disbanded. And that's when he became the sheriff here in Cochise County, Arizona. A guy like Harry Wheeler never stood a chance at peace. Maybe he would have been incapable of understanding what the miners felt. And maybe that's why Walter Douglas from Phelps Dodge decided to befriend the sheriff here in the remote Arizona town where he operated a mine. Maybe he thought this guy would like taking orders. With rifles pointed at their chests, over 2,000 miners were wrangled out of homes, businesses, restaurants, and mines across Bisbee. There were no trials on that morning. The posse of vigilantes who swarmed the town were free to apprehend any man that they deemed undesirable, including those who showed sympathy for the strikers. I wonder how many men must have been wrangled down the several steep streets and staircases that make up most of the town. The miners were then forced to march to Warren Baseball Park, not too far down the road from where Walter Douglas himself once lived. Here the men faced 2 high-caliber machine guns, probably ready to shred the next person who said anything about labor rights. Outside of the baseball park, the wives, friends, and neighbors of the striking miners screamed. Some yelled for their husbands to stand their ground. Some cried for their husbands to surrender. And others simply yelled for all of these men to get the hell out of their town. 800 miners were given a chance to renounce their cause and go back to work. The other 1,200 men doubled down on their convictions and refused to go back to work without seeing any of their demands met. Sheriff Wheeler was already a step ahead of them and had a convoy of 10 cattle cars readily stationed at the town's train depot, a favor from the Southern Pacific Railroad Company. From the ballpark, the armed men then formed columns steering the miners toward the cattle cars. The remaining strikers then said goodbye to their wives and children as they were loaded onto the cars with rifles and machine guns pointed at their backs. The train then lurched forward into the scorching July heat of the Sonoran Desert. For the next 18 hours, they endured what must have been an unbearable journey. Imagine the suffocating heat and dust that would have filled their noses, mouths, and lungs. The armed men stayed close by for most of the ride, both standing on top of the cattle cars and driving across dusty desert roads to keep up with the train. Every time the train stopped to refuel, 200 armed men surrounded the train cars, daring to shoot anybody who made a run for it. The cattle car suddenly came to a stop in the Tres Hermanas Mountains in Luna County, New Mexico, a random spot in the middle of nowhere. Most of the armed mob escorting the strikers had disappeared into the desert night. As the miners stepped off of the train cars, they heard a few words clearly via loudspeaker. Do not return to Bisbee. What happened next was truly American. New Mexico Governor Washington Lindsay knew what had happened was wrong, but he also felt he lacked the power to challenge Phelps Dodge. He could not send the train back to Arizona. After a call from Governor Lindsay, President Woodrow Wilson arranged for troops to escort these tortured miners to Columbus, New Mexico, where they were given temporary provisions and allowed to live in tents in the desert until September. Tents that had been left over from refugees of the Mexican Revolution. Back in Bisbee, security checkpoints were set up at every road leading into town. Anyone suspected of aiding or sympathizing with the miners was barred from returning. Both Harry Wheeler and William Brophy attempted to flee the specter of what they had done here by enlisting to fight in France. But in May of 1918, the Department of Justice issued arrest warrants for both of them, cutting their time in Europe short. They were both brought back to the hills of southeastern Arizona to face questioning, and so was Walter Douglas. But in the end, not one of the several defendants in this case faced any punishment for their roles in the deportation. Despite getting the attention of the U.S. Supreme Court, the judges decided that there were no federal laws protecting an individual's freedom of movement, and that it was up to the state to punish these men for what they had done. Arizona did nothing, and most of the miners never again returned to Bisbee. But who were these miners? Most were immigrants, symbols of a lost time when America threw open its doors to thousands of families from all over Europe. Many families in Bisbee had roots in places like England, Ireland, Finland, Russia, Slovakia, Austria, and Italy. Even Serbia had representation here at the turn of the century. They enriched America and Bisbee both with their traditions, cuisines, arts, and music from the old country. Much of what we now celebrate as American culture was shaped by immigrant hands, and traditions from all over Europe have been woven into our country's identity. But these people were also valued by the industrialists of this era for another reason: their willingness to work for nothing. For many, there was no real choice. They were locked out of land ownership, higher paying trades, and positions of power. Many worked tirelessly just to feed themselves. But the story of Bisbee, and of most of the southwestern United States, isn't just about white European immigrants. Roughly a third of those deported on that day were Mexican, born on both sides of the border. And remember that many Mexican families never crossed any border. The border crossed them. Bisbee itself remained part of Mexico even after the Mexican-American War concluded in 1848. This land was never seized. It was bought from Mexico 6 years later, after the war, as part of the Gadsden Purchase, a deal made to pave the way for railroads and industrial expansion. Yet, as I'm sure you know, contracts and treaties written by militaries hundreds of miles away provides no safety from the hatred of your own neighbors. Black and brown people, both immigrants and citizens, can attest to a greater society that has always reacted to their presence with fear, suspicion, and violence. Promises of equality have always come with fine print, and some people think they have more of a right to land and opportunity than others. As the time came for Phelps Dodge to identify its troublemakers, they made no distinctions between white or non-white, American or non-American. It made no difference. In this instance, all of the miners threatened corporate profits, so the bosses acted accordingly. Race is a human invention, in the same way that corporations are. But in a nation run by corporations, and in a society overwhelmed by questions on race, the enemy can always be painted the wrong color. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free. That line, etched onto the Statue of Liberty, once symbolized hope for a growing nation. But in Bisbee, that hope was denied. Were the tired, poor, huddled masses of Bisbee deemed unworthy of freedom? Anchored to the town he had stained with a dark legacy, Wheeler would have haunted Bisbee until the day he died from pneumonia in 1925. As for the corporation behind this catastrophe, they came out of this unharmed, as they always seem to. In America, corporations enjoy the rights of people, the wealth of nation-states, and the immunity of kings. Sometimes those in power will go to any length to stomp on those who stand for what is right. No law, no ideology, and no political argument could ever justify what was done to those 1,200 men on that day. Perhaps Bisbee paid a price. Since the year of the deportation, the town never recovered what it lost. After what happened to those miners, how could they ever return here? This street in Lowell is one of the last remaining links to the past. This is what's left of one of the oldest neighborhoods of Bisbee. Just this street. The rest of the town was eaten away slowly as the mines ran dry. Imagine the houses, libraries, theaters, and churches that must have been swallowed up in order to gouge the earth that lay beneath. It's almost as if the success of the mine, something the capitalists of the era were intent on securing at all costs, is directly what destroyed a future that could have bloomed here. The mine, a literal pit in the ground, swallowed up the people, swallowed up their town, and spat out shareholder value. In 1917, the price of raw copper had exploded. It's no surprise that Phelps Dodge felt compelled to deport over 1,000 miners on that hot summer. Simply put, there was a lot of money to be made. In 2007, the Phelps Dodge Corporation was acquired by Freeport-McMoRan, a southwestern mining giant headquartered in Phoenix. Many years have passed since this human tragedy, yet as I look around at the world we inhabit, I see many parallels to the world the miners of Bisbee knew. Examine the forces that are now trying to shape our society. Just as they did back then, those in power are working to weaken unions, shrink the share of prosperity we all deserve, and divide us for their own gain. The people are long gone, but the corporations that enabled their movements still exist and have endured decades of change. Do the monsters of the past ever truly vanish? Or do they merely evolve, taking on new forms in a society that constantly reinvents itself? I think that time is circular, and that the machine remains. Perhaps we should take lessons from what happened in Bisbee. It's been over 100 years, and the conversation has hardly shifted. Immigrants seeking work and stability are vilified and made out to be threats, even as their labor continues to fuel this experiment of a nation. Every morning, millions of Americans get up to go to work to sustain this rat race that we call the dream. No matter how you may perceive your own race in relation to that of others in America, to those far above either of us, your value as a laborer or as a deputy far exceeds your value as a person, as a thinker, or as an artist. Since its inception, America has idealized itself as a land of refuge, and the treasures of our society were built on the labor of those who had nowhere else to go. But in the time when we may be losing sight of this, what do we stand for?